The wooden doors of St. Augustine's swung open that Sunday morning, and what walked through them would tear the congregation apart. A man, hollow-eyed and trembling, stood in the entrance while the organ played its polished hymn. His clothes hung like rags soaked in diesel and rain. The pastor, Reverend Marcus Whitfield, froze mid-sentence, his sermon notes slipping from the pulpit. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And then the stranger spoke one verse that would haunt them all forever. Marcus Whitfield had built his empire on certainty. 32 years of ministry, a congregation of 800 souls, and a reputation that stretched across 3 counties. His church gleamed with stained glass imported from Bavaria, pews carved from cherry wood, and a sound system that could make whispers sound like the voice of heaven itself. Every Sunday, luxury cars filled the parking lot. Every Wednesday, business leaders sought his counsel. He was a man who knew God's will, or so he believed, until that morning proved him a stranger to grace. The sun rose over Richmond that day like any other, washing the church spire in gold. Marcus arrived at 6:30, his black sedan purring into the reserved spot near the side entrance. He carried his leather-bound Bible, the one his father gave him 4 decades ago, its pages thin as onion skin from a lifetime of turning. Inside his office, he rehearsed the sermon 3 times, perfecting every pause, every inflection. Today's message was about prosperity, about God's blessings for the faithful. He had statistics, testimonials, even a PowerPoint presentation. Everything was calculated, everything was controlled. By 9:45, the sanctuary filled with the scent of expensive perfume and fresh coffee from the lobby cafe. Women in silk dresses kissed each other's cheeks. Men in tailored suits discussed stock portfolios in hushed tones. The youth group, dressed in matching polo shirts, handed out bulletins with practiced smiles. This was a well-oiled machine, a place where faith wore a price tag and salvation came with a pledge card. Marcus watched from the wings, satisfied. This was his kingdom, this was his legacy. The service began with precision. The worship band played contemporary songs with just enough reverence to feel spiritual and just enough energy to feel alive. Hands raised, voices sang. The offering plates circulated, filling with checks that rarely dipped below 3 figures. Marcus stepped to the pulpit at exactly 10:32, adjusted the microphone and smiled at his flock. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to deliver another flawless performance, when the back doors creaked open. At first, it was just a shadow. Then the shadow became a shape. Then the shape became a man. He stumbled forward, each step uncertain, as if the ground beneath him might vanish. His face was weathered like driftwood, stubbled with grey, and his eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from too many nights with nowhere to go. A torn jacket hung from his shoulders, and his shoes were bound together with electrical tape. The smell reached the back rows first, a mix of unwashed skin, urine, and something else, something that spoke of alleys and desperation. The music stopped, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had cut the power. The drummer's sticks hovered mid-air. The guitarist's fingers froze on the fretboard. 800 heads turned in unison, and the silence that followed was the kind that suffocates. The man stood there, blinking against the lights, his lips moving soundlessly as if trying to remember why he'd come. Marcus gripped the pulpit, his knuckles white, his jaw tight. This was not part of the plan. This was not the image he'd spent 3 decades crafting. The stranger took another step forward, and someone in the 3rd row gasped. A mother pulled her child closer. An elder leaned toward his wife and whispered something sharp. The man seemed oblivious to the stairs, his gaze fixed on the cross hanging above the altar, a massive wooden structure that dominated the wall. He lifted one trembling hand toward it, and his mouth opened. For a moment, Marcus thought he might speak, might explain himself, might apologize for the disruption. Instead, the man simply stood there, tears beginning to carve clean lines through the dirt on his face. Marcus descended from the pulpit, his shoes clicking against the marble floor with authority. Every step was measured, deliberate, the walk of a man who'd handled countless disruptions before. He'd removed drunks, escorted out the mentally unstable, and politely redirected the confused. This would be no different. He approached the stranger with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that says, "I'm being gracious, but don't test me." He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, feeling the bones jutting through the thin fabric, and leaned in close enough to smell the sour breath. "Excuse me, friend," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I think you might be in the wrong place. There's a shelter about 6 blocks down Maple Street. They serve breakfast until 11. The man turned slowly, his eyes focusing on Marcus's face as if seeing him for the first time. Those eyes held something that made the pastor uncomfortable, not anger or defiance, but a kind of recognition, as if he knew Marcus better than Marcus knew himself. The stranger's lips moved again, forming words too quiet to hear over the collective holding of breath in the sanctuary. "What was that?" Marcus asked, his patience already wearing thin. The man cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting, and spoke louder. "I came to pray," he said simply. His voice was rough but steady, each word carefully chosen. "I came because I heard this was God's house." Marcus felt his smile tighten, felt the eyes of his congregation on his back, judging, waiting to see how their leader would handle this test. He squeezed the man's shoulder a fraction harder. "Of course it's God's house, but we have a service in progress. Perhaps you could come back another time when we're better prepared to help you." The man didn't move. He stood there, swaying slightly, his gaze drifting past Marcus to the people filling the pews. "Beautiful church," he murmured, his eyes tracing the vaulted ceiling, the crystal chandeliers, the rows of cushioned seats. Must have cost millions. Marcus felt heat rise in his neck. "Yes, well, our congregation has been very generous. We believe in excellence for God's glory." The stranger nodded slowly, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of his cracked lips. "Excellence," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Funny thing about excellence, Jesus didn't have a building, he preached on hillsides." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the sanctuary. Someone coughed, someone shifted in their seat. Marcus felt his control slipping, felt the carefully constructed narrative of his ministry beginning to fracture. His voice hardened. "I appreciate your perspective, friend, but this isn't the time or place for theological debates. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man's eyes met his again, and this time there was something else there, something that looked almost like pity. "I'm not here to debate, Reverend. I'm here because I have nowhere else to go." That admission, spoken so plainly, should have sparked compassion, should have reminded Marcus of every sermon he'd preached about loving the least of these, about opening doors to the broken, about being the hands and feet of Christ. Instead, it ignited something else, something uglier. Fear. Fear that this moment would define him differently than he'd planned. Fear that chaos would replace order. Fear that his carefully curated image would crack. He gestured to 2 ushers standing near the sound booth, both former college football players who volunteered as security. "Gentlemen, please escort our guest outside. Make sure he gets to the shelter safely." The ushers approached, their faces neutral, but their purpose clear. The stranger looked at them, then back at Marcus, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, but a deep, profound disappointment. "You're going to remove me?" he asked quietly. "From God's house?" Marcus felt the question like a blade between his ribs, but he pushed it aside. "We have protocols, we have procedures. You can't just walk in here disrupting everything." The man nodded slowly. "Protocols," he echoed. "I see." The ushers each took an arm, gently but firmly, and began to guide him back toward the doors. That's when it happened. The stranger stopped, planting his feet despite his obvious weakness. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly stronger. "Before you throw me out, let me ask you something. Do you know Matthew 25, verse 40? The question hung in the air, and Marcus felt his throat constrict. "Of course I know it. I'm a pastor." The man smiled, a genuine smile this time, though his eyes still glistened with unshed tears. "Then you know what it says. The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" The verse struck the congregation like lightning. Murmurs erupted. A woman in the front row brought her hand to her mouth. An elder closed his eyes and bowed his head. Marcus stood frozen, the words reverberating in his skull. Words he'd quoted 1,000 times, words he'd preached about, words that suddenly felt like an indictment. The stranger wasn't finished. He looked around the sanctuary, his gaze touching every face, every averted eye, every uncomfortable shifting of weight. "I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. The man pulled free from the ushers, not violently but with a quiet dignity that made them step back. He walked slowly to the center aisle, turned to face the congregation one last time, and spoke in a voice that carried despite its brokenness. "You have a beautiful church, beautiful pews, beautiful glass, beautiful music. But I wonder, when Christ looks at this place, does he see beauty? Or does he see 800 people who forgot what he actually said?" Then he turned and walked out. The doors closed behind him with a soft click that echoed like thunder. Marcus stood paralyzed, his sermon note still clutched in his hand, his carefully prepared message about prosperity suddenly seeming obscene. He looked out at his congregation and saw confusion, shame, anger, conviction, all swirling together in a collective crisis. Someone in the back started crying. An elder stood and walked out without a word. The worship leader sat down heavily at the edge of the stage, his head in his hands. Marcus climbed back to the pulpit, his legs weak, his mind reeling. He tried to speak, tried to salvage the moment, tried to explain that they had rules for a reason, that chaos couldn't be allowed, that intentions mattered. But the words died in his throat, because deep down, in a place he'd stopped listening to years ago, he knew the truth. The stranger had been right. The verse had been forgotten, not intellectually but practically. They'd built a fortress and called it a church. They'd created a club and called it a kingdom. And in that moment, Marcus Whitfield, pastor of 800, realized he'd become a Pharisee in a tailored suit. He dismissed the service early, his voice hollow as he offered a brief prayer that felt like ash in his mouth. The congregation filed out slowly, groups forming in the parking lot to discuss what had happened, to process the disruption, to decide whose side they were on. Some were angry at the homeless man for causing a scene. Others were angry at Marcus for removing him. A few simply stood in silence, convicted by truths they'd been avoiding. The church that had been so unified an hour ago now fractured along invisible fault lines, and Marcus knew nothing would ever be the same. Alone in his office, Marcus sat in the leather chair his congregation had given him for his 30th anniversary. He stared at his Bible, still open to the sermon notes tucked inside. Prosperity, blessing, favor. Words that suddenly felt empty. He flipped to Matthew 25 and read the entire passage, the parable of the sheep and the goats, the judgment of nations based not on correct theology or perfect attendance, but on how they treated the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned. His eyes blurred with tears as he reached the final verse. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. His phone buzzed, text messages from board members, calls from concerned elders, an email from the church's attorney asking if they needed to file an incident report. Marcus ignored them all. He stood, grabbed his keys, and walked out of the church, past the cafe where volunteers were already cleaning up, past the bookstore selling merchandise with the church logo, past the framed photos of every major event and building expansion. He got in his car and drove, his hands shaking on the wheel, until he reached Maple Street. The shelter was a converted warehouse, its brick walls tagged with graffiti, its windows barred for security. A line of people stretched around the corner, waiting for the breakfast service. Marcus parked and walked along the line, searching faces, looking for the man who'd shattered his world. He found him near the back, sitting on a concrete step, his head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed. Marcus approached slowly, uncertain, and cleared his throat. The stranger opened his eyes, unsurprised to see him standing there. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words feeling inadequate, pathetic even. "I was wrong." The man studied him for a long moment, then patted the step beside him. Marcus sat, his expensive slacks against the dirty concrete, and for the first time in decades he didn't care about appearances. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the line shuffle forward. Finally, the stranger spoke. "My name is Thomas. I used to be like you." Marcus turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Like me?" Thomas nodded. "I was a pastor too. Small church in Ohio. Had everything figured out. Then my wife died. Cancer. I lost myself after that. Lost the church. Lost my home. Lost my faith. Or so I thought." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "I don't know what to say." Thomas smiled slightly. "You don't have to say anything. Just listen. I've been on the streets for 3 years now. I've been spit on, beaten, robbed, ignored. But I've also met Jesus in ways I never did behind a pulpit. In the face of a prostitute who shared her last cigarette with me. In the hands of a junkie who bandaged my foot when I cut it on broken glass. In the silence of a schizophrenic man who sat with me all night when I thought about ending it. Jesus isn't in your building, Marcus. He's out here, with the forgotten ones. The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Marcus thought about his sermons, his programs, his strategic plans for church growth. When had he last sat with someone broken? When had he last gotten his hands dirty with real human suffering? When had he last prioritized people over image? He couldn't remember. The realization crushed him. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at him with those ancient eyes. "You start by remembering what you forgot. That the gospel isn't about buildings or budgets. It's about love. Radical, uncomfortable, inconvenient love." Marcus stayed at that shelter all day. He helped serve breakfast, mopping up spilled coffee and scraping dishes. He listened to stories from men and women who'd fallen through every crack society offered. He held the hand of an elderly veteran shaking from withdrawal. He prayed with a teenage girl who'd run away from an abusive home. By the time the sun set, his clothes were stained, his hair disheveled, and something inside him had broken open in a way that felt like dying and being born at the same time. That night, he returned to his house, a 4-bedroom colonial in a gated community. His wife, Patricia, met him at the door, her face tight with worry and frustration. She'd heard about the incident from a dozen different sources, each version more dramatic than the last. "Marcus, what happened today? The whole church is in chaos. People are threatening to leave. The board wants an emergency meeting." He looked at her, this woman he'd built a life with, and saw the fear in her eyes. Fear of losing status, fear of losing security, fear of everything they'd worked for crumbling. He understood that fear because he'd felt it too, but he also knew he couldn't live under its weight anymore. "Patricia," Marcus said softly, taking her hands in his, "I think we've been wrong about everything." She pulled back, confusion and anger mixing on her face. "Wrong about what? We've built a thriving church. We've helped thousands of people. We've been faithful." He shook his head. "No, we've been successful. There's a difference. We've built a business that happens to mention Jesus. We've created a community for people who already have everything. But we've locked out the people who actually need grace." His wife stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "You're upset. You're not thinking clearly. Maybe you should take a few days off." Marcus spent the next week in turmoil. The board called the emergency meeting. 40 people crammed into the conference room, faces ranging from concerned to hostile. They reviewed the incident frame by frame, dissecting every word, every action. Some argued Marcus had acted appropriately, maintaining order and safety. Others said he'd embarrassed the church, created liability. A few, mostly younger members, suggested maybe the homeless man had a point. The meeting lasted 4 hours and solved nothing. Marcus left feeling more alone than ever, caught between the institution he'd built and the conviction burning in his chest. He started visiting the shelter daily, not as a project or a program, but simply as a human being trying to understand. Thomas became his guide, introducing him to the invisible community living in Richmond's shadows. There was Daniel, a former accountant whose gambling addiction had cost him everything. There was Maria, a mother of 3 whose mental illness had separated her from her children. There was Raymond, a philosopher who quoted Dostoevsky while digging through dumpsters for recyclables. Each person carried a universe of pain and wisdom, and Marcus realized he'd never actually seen them before. They'd always been props in his sermons, abstract concepts to illustrate grace, never real humans deserving dignity. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus stood before his congregation again. He'd prepared no notes, no PowerPoint, no clever illustrations. He simply stood at the pulpit and told the truth. "I've been your pastor for 32 years, he began, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "In that time, I've preached thousands of sermons. I've married your children, buried your parents, counseled your marriages. I thought I knew what ministry meant. I was wrong. The sanctuary was packed, more people than usual, drawn by the controversy swirling around the church. They leaned forward, waiting. 3 weeks ago, a man walked through those doors, Marcus continued, pointing to the back entrance. He was dirty, he smelled, he disrupted our perfect service, and I threw him out. I used spiritual language to justify it. I talked about protocols and procedures, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of mess, afraid of what you'd think, afraid of losing control. And in that fear, I forgot the one thing Jesus made absolutely clear. When we reject the broken, the poor, the outcast, we reject him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others crossed their arms. Patricia sat in the front row, her face unreadable. Marcus's voice grew stronger. That man's name is Thomas. He was a pastor before he lost everything, and he taught me more about Jesus in 3 weeks than I've learned in 3 decades of ministry. Because he knows what it means to have nothing and depend entirely on grace. He knows what it means to be invisible, to be judged, to be dismissed. And he quoted scripture that we've all memorized but stopped practicing. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. The words hung in the air, and Marcus saw tears on several faces, conviction settling like snow. Here's what I propose, Marcus said, his heart pounding. Starting next week, we're going to open this building every night as a shelter. We're going to feed people who are hungry. We're going to provide showers, clean clothes, and a safe place to sleep. We're going to stop talking about the gospel and start living it. I know this will be uncomfortable. I know some of you will leave, but I can't stand before you anymore and preach a Jesus we're not willing to follow. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the back, a single person stood and began clapping. Then another. Not everyone. About half the congregation rose to their feet, applause mixing with tears. The other half sat frozen, faces hard, already calculating their exit. The next months were brutal. 200 people left the church, taking their tithes with them. The budget collapsed. The staff had to be cut in half. Board members resigned. Lawyers threatened lawsuits over liability concerns. Marcus's house went on the market to cover personal expenses when his salary was reduced. Patricia struggled, caught between supporting her husband and grieving the life they'd lost. But something else happened too. New people started coming. Not the wealthy and connected, but the broken and desperate. The sanctuary, once pristine, now showed signs of wear. The carpet stained, the pews scratched. But it was alive in a way it never had been before. Thomas became part of the leadership team, bringing a perspective that challenged every assumption. The church partnered with addiction counselors, mental health professionals, and job training programs. They converted the fellowship hall into a dormitory. The kitchen served 3 meals a day. The counseling rooms ran 12-hour shifts. It was messy. It was exhausting. It was expensive. And it was the most authentic thing Marcus had ever been part of. He watched transformations happen slowly, painfully, beautifully. Daniel got sober and found work. Maria reconnected with her children. Raymond published a collection of poetry that moved readers to tears. One Sunday morning, exactly 1 year after the incident, Marcus stood to preach. The congregation was smaller now, maybe 300 people, but diverse in ways it never had been. Homeless men sat next to former executives. Addicts in recovery shared pews with soccer moms. The demographic was chaos, and it was beautiful. Marcus looked out at them and smiled. A year ago today, a man walked through our doors and changed everything. He reminded us of a truth we'd forgotten, that the gospel isn't about comfort or success or reputation. It's about radical love for the people society has discarded. And I want to tell you, this year has been the hardest of my life. We've lost money, members, and prestige. But we've gained something infinitely more valuable. We've gained our souls. The congregation erupted in amens and applause. Marcus raised his hand for quiet. Today, I want to introduce you to someone. He gestured to the side door, and Thomas walked in clean-shaven, wearing a donated suit that almost fit, looking 10 years younger. He's agreed to join our pastoral staff, Marcus announced, because he knows things about Jesus that I'm still learning. Thomas approached the pulpit, his hands shaking slightly, and looked out at the faces watching him. Some he recognized from his early visits. Others were new. All were paying attention in a way that felt sacred. I don't have a fancy sermon prepared, Thomas began, his voice rough but clear. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for opening your doors when most churches locked theirs. Thank you for choosing people over property. Thank you for remembering that Jesus spent most of his ministry outside religious buildings, eating with sinners and touching lepers and defending prostitutes. You saved my life, not by giving me charity, but by giving me dignity, by treating me like a human being made in God's image. That's the gospel. Not words, action. The service continued with a raw authenticity that felt nothing like the polished performances of the past. People prayed honestly about their struggles. They sang without perfection but with passion. They shared communion with hands that trembled from withdrawal and hands that had never known want, and in that moment, something transcendent happened. The veil between heaven and earth grew thin, and everyone felt it. This was what church was supposed to be, not a monument to human success, but a hospital for broken souls. After the service, Marcus stood in the parking lot, watching people linger, not wanting to leave. Patricia came to his side, slipping her hand into his. She'd aged this year, the stress showing in new lines around her eyes, but she'd also grown, her faith deepening through the fire. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "I was angry for so long, angry that you destroyed what we built, but you didn't destroy it, you redeemed it." Marcus kissed her forehead, grateful beyond words for her willingness to walk this painful path beside him. Thomas approached, a young woman with him, someone Marcus recognized from the shelter. "This is my daughter," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "She found me 3 months ago. Been looking for 2 years after I disappeared." The woman, maybe 35, with Thomas's same eyes, smiled through tears. "I thought he was dead," she said. "I'd given up hope, but someone from this church helped me track him down. Told me what you were doing here." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "We're just trying to live like Jesus actually taught us to." The woman shook her head. "You're doing more than that. You're giving people their lives back." That evening, as the sun set over Richmond, Marcus sat in his office, now much smaller since they'd converted most of the administrative space into shelter rooms. He looked at the photo on his desk, the one from his ordination 35 years ago. He'd been so young, so certain, so naive. He thought ministry would be about building something impressive, leaving a legacy, being respected. He'd never imagined it would mean losing everything to find what actually mattered. But sitting there, exhausted and broke and more fulfilled than ever, he understood something profound. Success in God's kingdom looked nothing like success in the world. It looked like washing feet, like touching lepers, like defending the accused, like welcoming strangers even when it cost you everything. His phone rang. The area's largest news station wanted to do a story about the church's transformation. Marcus hesitated, old instincts rising. Publicity could bring donations, volunteers, influence. Then he remembered why they'd started this, not for recognition, but for obedience. He declined the interview politely. This wasn't about building his reputation back. This was about staying invisible in the ways that mattered, letting the work speak for itself, resisting the temptation to turn sacrifice into spectacle. Months turned into years. The church stabilized at a smaller size but deeper impact. They became a model for other congregations wrestling with the same questions. How do you honor tradition while embracing transformation? How do you maintain biblical fidelity while extending radical grace? How do you build community without building walls? Marcus and Thomas co-led, their partnership a living testimony to redemption. One had fallen from respectability and climbed back. The other had fallen from pride and found humility. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, the church held a celebration. They invited everyone whose life had been touched by the ministry. The sanctuary overflowed. People who'd been homeless now had jobs. Addicts celebrated years of sobriety. Families had been reunited. Countless stories of transformation filled the evening. But the most powerful moment came when Thomas stood and said, "5 years ago I walked into this church desperate and broken. I was thrown out, and that rejection became the seed of resurrection, because one man chose conviction over comfort, one congregation chose obedience over reputation, and hundreds of lives were changed forever." Marcus stood beside him, older now, grayer, but with eyes that shone with a peace he'd never known in his ambitious youth. "We didn't change your lives," he said to the crowd. "You changed ours. You taught us what we'd forgotten. That Jesus isn't found in programs or buildings or perfect theology. He's found in the faces of the suffering, in the voices of the voiceless, in the dignity of every human soul, no matter how broken." And that's not a lesson you learn once, it's a lesson you live every single day. The celebration ended with communion served by people who'd once slept on the streets. Former addicts held the bread. Former prostitutes poured the wine. And in that sacred moment, as the most unlikely hands distributed grace, something pure and holy filled the space. This was the church Christ had envisioned. Not perfect, not polished, not impressive by worldly standards, but alive with the kind of love that costs everything and gives even more. The kind of love that doesn't just quote scripture, but embodies it. The kind of love that sees the homeless man at the door and says, "Welcome home." As people filed out into the night, Marcus and Thomas stood together at the entrance, shaking hands, hugging necks, blessing lives. An elderly woman stopped, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thank you for not giving up," she whispered. "Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to become who we were meant to be." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "It's never too late. That's the promise of grace. We can always begin again." When the last person left, Marcus locked the doors and walked through the empty sanctuary. He ran his hand along the pews, now scarred from years of hard use. He looked at the stained glass windows, some cracked from opening them constantly for ventilation. He breathed in the smell that now permanently lived in the carpet, a mix of industrial cleaner and human life. This building had lost its polish, but it had gained a soul. And standing there in the silence, Marcus heard something he'd missed for decades. Not the voice of ambition or achievement or success, but the still, small voice of God whispering, "Well done, good and faithful servant." He turned off the lights and walked out into the night where Thomas waited by his car. They'd become more than colleagues. They'd become brothers, united by the kind of bond that only forms when you've walked through fire together and come out transformed. "You ready for tomorrow?" Thomas asked, grinning. They had a new project starting, a mobile outreach program to reach people who couldn't make it to the shelter. Marcus laughed, the sound free and genuine. "As ready as I'll ever be." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all God asks, not perfection, just willingness." They drove away from the church, its steeple rising against the stars, and Marcus thought about the verse that had changed everything. "Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." He'd heard those words 1,000 times. He'd preached them, he'd memorized them, but he'd never truly understood them until a broken man quoted them back to him at his moment of greatest failure. Now they were written not just on his heart, but in his hands, in his choices, in every interaction with every person society had deemed worthless. Now they were his life, not just his theology. The city lights blurred past as they drove toward the next opportunity to serve, the next chance to see Christ in unexpected faces. And Marcus knew, with a certainty deeper than any he'd felt standing behind a pulpit, that this was what it meant to follow Jesus. Not to build kingdoms, but to serve kings dressed in rags. Not to create monuments, but to wash feet. Not to achieve greatness, but to embrace smallness. This was the narrow path, the hard road, the invitation to lose your life so you could finally find it. And though it had cost him everything he once valued, he'd never been richer.